Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we are going to begin day 2 of Unit 5.7, Economic Developments and Innovations in the Industrial Age. And our learning objective is to explain the development of economic systems, ideologies, and institutions, and how they contributed to change in the period of 1750 to 1900. All right. So specifically today we're going to focus in on the ideologies of Adam Smith. Right, but before we do that, we need to kind of just do a little quick wrap up of our little some skill practice with these transnational businesses. So let's look at this question. In what ways do transnational businesses constitute a continuity? So kind of looking at our skills of continuity and change, right? In what ways do the rise of transnational businesses constitute a continuity? So go ahead and think, what would you put for an answer for that? All right, so some typical answers that we might come up with in class, just let me give you an example. That is, let's go ahead and write this stuff out. So transnational businesses, right? And specifically, in what ways is it a continuity? Right, in which ways does it constitute a continuity from the previous periods? All right, so looking at continuity. So I guess first off, kind of identify what will we even be talking about to make the connection of a continuity. Let me try to resume that again. It's a little blurry. All right. So what will we be talking about to even say it's a continuity? I guess specifically we'd be referring to the joint stock companies. All right. So the joint stock companies, for example, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company are the two most well-known examples. However, we've kind of looked at a whole bunch. So in what ways does transnational businesses constitute a continuity? It is a continuity of the traditions that were established by the joint stock companies such as the Dutch East India Company or VOC and the British East India Company. One way or one example in that they are similar, right, to these previous institutions, right, is that they both sell shares, right? They both sell shares to spread risk and profits. All right, so they both go hand in hand. And they also both, right, they both operate outside of their country of origin. All right, so you might even call them both a proxy for colonialism, right, by the nation. Right, these transnational businesses definitely are operating for the interest or within the interest of the country in which they originate. So maybe you call them a proxy. All right, so I guess since we're doing continuity, you might as well just go ahead and try to kind of figure out in what ways do transnational businesses constitute a change. All right, since we're playing around with the scale of CCOT, let's just go ahead and finish that, right? So, I guess one easy way to kind of delineate the two is that they are not state-sponsored, right? They are not a state-sponsored entity. So what are we kind of talking about here is, they do not, I'm talking about the transnational businesses here. They do not enjoy, right, the monopoly, right, associated with mercantilistic practices. All right, so the joint stock companies, operated under, a prevailing economic ideology of mercantilism, and these transnational businesses are going to have to, and let's just kind of throw this in here, competition. Right, competition within industries, right, within countries, right, within countries. Right, so that's kind of a different operational theater, that they're both going to have to deal with. One of the other things here, right, is increasing liability protections. Right, so this is something that we're going to see, kind of evolve over time. Right, is these increasing liability protections that are going to become increasingly associated with these companies. Okay. All right, so there's just kind of a little answer to this little starter, since we looked at United Fruit Company yesterday, or during the last video. All right, so these are our transnationals that we need to at least be aware of. All right, but today let's get into the individual ideologies. All right, so the ideology of capitalism, or sometimes called the price system, or free market economics, or the market. Right? It goes by all kinds of different names. But what we're talking about here is we're talking about capitalism, the movement away from mercantilism, right? This kind of government heavy-handed top-down approach. Right, so capitalism is more of a bottom-up kind of economic system. Right, so we're just going to go over some of these concepts that we associate. I know from the most part, these are going to review. You've dealt with these concepts throughout your life, and they should be relatively familiar, but I just do want to kind of just take a second and make sure you're applying them correctly. So this notion of productivity, division of labor, specialization, voluntary exchange, individuals and states, this concept of laissez-faire economic principles, Adam Smith's, this concept of the invisible hand. I also want to look into that for a few minutes. There's also these realities of these free trade policies that we often associate with the rise of capitalism. So how does the Industrial Revolution result in, imperialism, and where do these policies fit in? And look at some examples of how free trade resulted in imperialism. All right, so there's this kind of basic starter question with this is, are there any truly capitalist economies in the world today? And, this is one of those, kind of an interesting question, is, because it does flush out the differences between government and economics. So just because a country is a democracy doesn't mean it's capitalist. Just because it's, an autocratic government doesn't mean it's not capitalist, right? Some autocratic governments are highly capitalist, and some democracies are, very far from capitalists, right? So, there is definitely a distinction between government and economics. All right, so let's just kind of take a second here as well. The way that you learn about this, I guess, when you're younger. One is, a lot of times you'll see a continuum, or a spectrum, an economic spectrum. It'll look something like this, right? Pushing out this way, you'll have like market economy, your market economy, or capitalism, whatever you want to call it. Over pushing towards the left, you'll have a command economy, right? Or call it socialism or communism, whatever you want to call it. Let's just throw communism on there, right? And somewhere towards the middle, you usually get a little dotted line, and this will say mixed economy. right? And you'll get your kind of, socialist somewhere right here, democratic socialist, or whatever you want to call this stuff, right? So this is the kind of generally how you would answer this question. And then somewhere over here you would get like let's call this a North Korea, a Cuba, somewhere probably over here these days you'll probably get something like a China. Somewhere over here these days you'll probably get something like United States. Like generally over here somewhere you might get like a Singapore. Right. So this is a continuum that looks at where countries are relative to each other on the economic spectrum. All right. And so what makes a country, right, kind of fall into these categories is you can break down any number of measures in order to kind of place a country on here. One of the things I like to point out, when I do go over stuff like this, is if this is where the USA is today, where was the USA in the year 1900? And you may want to kind of throw like here we have USA maybe 1900. Maybe over here you might have USA in 1885. Maybe before our antitrust acts get passed and stuff like that. So right, so different policies mean different things. So what are the policies, right, that would cause shifts? If you take specifically the United States or U.S. history, there's been all kinds, kind of major shifts. So specifically, you want to look at some of the big ones, the biggest ones in our history. 1913 is a big one, right? 1913. You've got a couple things actually. You've got the income tax amendment, right? So income tax, right, amendment. And you also have the Federal Reserve created, right? The Federal Reserve, or sometimes referred to as the creature from Jekyll Island, since that was its place of origin. So that would be a big one. Some other good examples, would be, from 1933 through, let's just say the early 1940s, and these are our New Deal programs. Things like, i.e., Social Security, right? Stuff like that, right? So that'd be like another kind of good example of when the United States would have shifted, this direction. You also have, there's a whole bunch of others, so 1964 through 68, we have our Great Society, right? Our Great Society programs, right? So this is Johnson. Often is sometimes kind of thrown in here in the mix. Would be like 2006, right? Our the Medicare Reforms, Prescription Drug Act reforms made by George H.W. Bush, right? So. Right, prescription drug act, and you could also put in there like year 2000. I think it was 2009. The Health Care Act that was passed during the Obama administration. Right, so health care reform. All right, so these are kind of all examples of things that would kind of put us, right, kind of move us incrementally, right, to the into the mixed economic, right, mixed economy. All right, so anyway, I'm kind of getting a little off tangent here. All right, so to answer this question, that's this. All right, so we're just going to run down a few things, make sure we hit these words and make sure we kind of understand. Before we do this, I generally start class today by doing a quick sourcing. So let's just take a moment, source this. So go ahead and read this and tell me how you would source it. the HIPP, and then go ahead and actually try to source it. All right, so go ahead and pause and try that. All right, and welcome back. All right, so one of the examples here, right, we have here. So this is really point of view, right? So Whelan and Company wanted to celebrate Manchester, show it in its best light. While it's true that Manchester is a major manufacturing center, the money coming into Manchester did not make its way to the workers in the factories and often work for low wages and are in dangerous working conditions. So really, this is looking at your limitations or your point of view. Right? If your only point of view of the city of Manchester in the year 1852 is this one, then you're obviously not seeing the city of Manchester through the point of view of the vast majority of people who would have worked there and lived there. Right? So this is one way to source for point of view. Oftentimes, kids in class will actually source this for purpose. Saying that they are, this is trying to entice different businesses to come to the city of Manchester, and they'll kind of look at the competition that exists between individual cities, and that's why you are seeing that the city of Manchester is being positively compared to other competitive cities that are out there. I actually find contextualizing a little bit more challenging for this one. Generally students will talk about how who successfully do it, we'll talk about how maybe 50 years earlier, Manchester was not a city. It was actually a small farming village and, a rural village, but because it has the preconditions for industrialization, they are, so they're on a river, they have, easy access to coal, being in the north of England, that you're going to see the process of urbanization take place there, hence resulting in its charter of a city, right, by 52. I find that to be a little bit more of a challenging way of looking at it, but that's it's whatever's easiest for you. All right, so let's get into Adam Smith, and I just like to read through this with students and make sure we kind of understand this, and just kind of make sure we're on the right page here. So really, this is looking at this idea of the invisible hand. All right, so what does this say? Adam Smith believed that individuals should be free to pursue their own economic self-interest, right? Things that will bring you personal gain or benefit through pursuing their own self-interest. Smith believed that all society would benefit. Smith argued that people would make things that feed their self-interest of increasing their wealth and profit, such as the coat maker who makes the coat, even though he is making coats out of self-interest and selfish desire for profits. Smith argued that this would still benefit the rest of society because people need coats and are willing to pay for them. Smith believes that the economy like this should work smoothly, right, and efficiently without government interference, as if guided by and organized by an invisible hand, right? So you hear this concept, invisible hand. This is a metaphor for the self-regulating economy, right, where people get what they need by pursuing their own self-interest. Okay, people are free to make their own decisions. There is, to kind of go back to this here, there is a voluntary exchange, right, for individuals. It also works for states or for countries as well. But there's a voluntary exchange that exists. All right, so what is Smith really saying here? I generally like to kind of visualize this in the most basic way of economics. To visualize this is to just explain it like this. All right, what is the invisible hand? So, all right, price, quantity. All right, so what Adam Smith is saying here, or what is being said here, for Adam Smith, is that there are people out there who will make coats, right, or who will sell coats. I don't care how you want to look at this. These people are suppliers, right? These are the suppliers. The suppliers supply, right? They make the jackets or they sell the jackets not because they truly care that you're cold or not cold, right? They are supplying this because they want to generate a profit by selling it, right? And they are purely acting in their own self-interest, right? They want to make money, right? So there's also a group of people out there, right? These are the demanders, right? Why do they demand a coat, right? They don't demand a coat because they want to make the suppliers rich. They demand a coat because it's cold, right? And they will demand, right, this product. And they are also acting in their own self-interest. Their self-interest, right, is to be warm, but it's also to not give the suppliers of jackets any more money than what they absolutely have to, right? So what we have here is two opposing forces. The suppliers who, will push to make the price of a jacket as expensive as possible, and you have the demanders who are working against them, trying to push the price down, right? And these two will come together, right, at this point here, right? And we call this point here our EP, or our equilibrium price. And our equilibrium price is where the most number of demanders match up with the most number of suppliers. And then this will become our kind of average price, or our typical price for, in this case of our example here, a jacket. All right. And this is assuming that there is competition, right, amongst individual suppliers, that there isn't winners that are picking, or that are chosen, that there aren't winners that are chosen, that people have the right to start a business if they want, and so this is assuming that competition exists, competition for suppliers to get into the market, and this also assumes that there is, demanders are allowed to freely choose, right, in order to make this system work. So we have our producers, we have our consumers, right? All right, so the producers try to sell their supply to the highest price, right? And but this is limited by how much consumers demand it, how much they're willing to pay for it. Both sides are acting in their own self-interest, right? And we assume that there's competition. So if you're not familiar with those words that I said, this is what they're talking about, or this is what they mean. All right, moving on. All right, so Smith believed that consumers can get what they needed, right? Smith believed that consumers can get what they needed, people could generate wealth, right, and prices would set themselves all without government interference. Smith warned that if entrepreneurs do not have a profit incentive to take risks and innovate, and if the buyers can't buy from whomever they want, and if sellers can't set their own prices, then the economy will not work right. He advocates that producers and consumers be left free to make their own decisions, right? This idea that the free market is known as capitalism, and this idea that the government just needs to back off, right? If the government interferes in this system, either props up the demanders or takes away the profit motives, then this is a violation of what becomes known as laissez-faire, right? The market mechanisms work most efficiently when they are left to their own devices. All right, so what is that simply referring to? Kind of going back to this image here. All right, so if there is a demand for goods, then and demand is, let's say there is a rightward shift in demand. So then this will become our D2. There may not be enough suppliers. Right? There may not be enough suppliers, to supply it at a price that people are willing to pay. But because the price is up for the item, more people will then join the system. All right, not because the government forces them to, or not because anyone forces them to. It's just more people are going to see that there's profits to be made, simply by jumping in and starting to supply this item. So. And eventually the market will stabilize. We saw this very recently in 2020. Take what happens with the toilet papers, right? With the toilet paper supply. So there was lockdowns that were instituted across the country. Because of those lockdowns, more people were buying household toilet paper instead of the more industrial toilet papers that you'll see in your bathrooms. At work or at schools or that kinds of places, and then there was disequilibrium that existed within the market. There was enough supply of household toilet paper in order to meet the demand, so there were shortages, right? So how were those shortages overcome? The shortages were overcome because the suppliers realized that there was money to be made by increasing the supply. So, you saw a rightward shift in the supply of household toilet paper, and right, so that then, right, this then goes to S1, and that brought us to S2, and then that changed our equilibrium price and brought it back more in tune with what it was before. Okay, so if the market is allowed to operate, then it'll eventually bring itself into harmony, and bring it back, because people are going to want to generate profits when they see these kinds of opportunities. All right. So this is a very famous passage, right? Very famous passage from Smith. So I'm just going to read this. So, but man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren. It is in vain for him to expect it be from their benevolence only. So we generally talk about that in class, just make sure students understand what this is saying. Give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want. And it is this manner that we obtain from one another a far greater part of those good offices for which we stand in need of. It is, and this is probably one of the most famous lines quoted from Adam Smith, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, right? But from regard to their own self-interest, right? So why does the butcher do what they do? Not because they care about me eating hamburgers with my family. The butcher creates their business, right? They start their business to make money, right? And I have to realize, right, as the demander, that there is a basic expectation of profits that exists. Why is there a basic expectation of profits? Because there were risks that were taken. That butcher went out and rented a place with their own money, or they bought the property and built the place with their own money. They bought the supplies in order to grind the beef up or to slice the beef. They bought the packaging with their own money. They went and bought the cows, right, or the raw materials that were needed in order to butcher. And they did all that. They put out all those costs of, they put out all that own money, as a risk that they knew that they were taking in the hopes that they would be able to generate a profit. All right. They're not doing it because they care what I eat. They're making all those risks, or taking all those risks because they want to generate a profit. All right. So it is only for the sake of profit that any man, right, uses their own capital, right, their own money in the support of industry. Right? That's why people do this. So he is in this. And I'm just gonna kind of jump here. He is in this. Many of the cases led by an invisible hand, right? So when there appears to be profits to be made, somebody will jump in, right, and supply those things, right, and that meets demand. All right. So, right, kind of just taking back on this real quick. Right, so this is all done through voluntary exchange, right? So I don't go to the butcher, right, because I have to go to the butcher. I go because they're fulfilling an obligation or they're fulfilling a need that I have. I'm getting something in exchange, and the butcher is doing it for their own benefit as well. In class when I talked about this recently, I talked about the fact that I was driving my car the other day and I got a hole in my coolant system. I have no idea what a coolant system even is. I just know that's what my computer told me on my car. Right. So I went to a local tire repair or auto repair shop. And they're charging me hundreds of dollars in order to fix that. Right. So do I want to pay that? Well, probably not. But I also have to understand that I need a service provided. And that is a competitive price for that service. So, right, and so I need to understand that they're going to generate a profit. That's just part of it. And I know he generates a profit, the person who owns that business, because I see photographs of him and his 68 Camaro on the wall. And so I know that he's generating a profit. But that's why he started a business. That's why he takes a risk in order for him to get that profit. And I'm getting something in return as well, right? I'm getting my car back in working order, and so I am exchanging my money for those services as a voluntary exchange, right? So, and what happens, or how does the government get involved in these kinds of things? I thought I had a slide on this, but maybe I don't. How does the government get involved in these things? they can get involved in any number of ways, right? So anything that would interfere with this profit system or this profit motive would be an example of government intervention or a violation of these principles of laissez-faire. So raising taxes, right? Raising taxes would reduce profits, thus reducing the incentive for someone to generate, for someone to start a business. Minimum wage laws, right? That's going to reduce your profits, and reduce the incentive to start businesses or to run businesses. Government regulation in general, EPA, OSHA, any of that kind of stuff, right? All those kinds of things are examples of things, of the government interfering in the system, that impacts profit motives. Okay, and so that's all we're referring to. Regarding this division of labor and specialization, it's no shocker that specialization exists within free markets. Specialization becomes it is definitely not something new, that we see during the Industrial Revolution. Cottage industries are examples of specialization that existed since the medieval period. But it's the degree of specialization, just how specialized it is, that people become. And as a student, this should be no shock to you. Your teachers are specialized. I teach AP World History all day, every day. I've got a master's degree in this kind of stuff. I've been doing this for 20 plus years. I have a level of human capital for this specific content. Why don't I teach physics? I took physics in college. So it's not that I can't do physics. It's just that is not my specialization. So to have me teach physics would not be the best choice. I could probably do it. F equals MA. That's generally how I would teach every day physics. But that's why I don't teach it. All right, so we understand how specialization works. But one of the realities of the Industrial Revolution is specialization. It takes on a more scientific approach here. So I have a quote here from John Merriman's lecture, available on the Open Yale courses if you're interested in this stuff. But he talks about Taylorism. So I'm just going to jump around off this quote a little bit. So in the beginning of the 20th century, the American engineer called Taylor comes up with this way of measuring units of production, right? The ultimate in industrial discipline, right? You're on the assembly line. They will count the number of units you can do of jars of apple butter that you can turn out. All right, so Taylorism is the application of a scientific way of looking at production and efficiency. And, right, so people had specialized for hundreds of years, right, before the Industrial Revolution. But, now we're specializing on one point of an assembly line, and you may be one of 200 different steps in the production. That means you have no idea how the actual car is built. You only know how to do your one specific task, right? That's what specialization refers to, And Taylorism is this concept that, or the scientific way of approaching this, how to measure this. How do you individually compare to the person next to you who does your job or on the different shift? Are you more or less efficient than that person? Or are you more or less efficient than the person who did it previous to you? And of course, if you're less efficient, then maybe you need to be fired, and maybe someone who is more efficient can be hired for that. So this way we get maximum efficiency. And of course, if because your task is so specialized, so rote, you can be replaced, right? So there is a limited amount of human capital actually involved in a lot of these tasks, right? So in kind of an interesting kind of take to kind of show how this kind of applies today, because this is a scientific process. The scientific revolution doesn't just stop with the orbits of the planets. The scientific, this scientific way of looking at the world applies to business, and of course you can, apply this all the way to today, right? So this is an interesting little excerpt or little adage here by Michelle Perot. When she predicts in 1978 what would replace Taylorism would be the computer. The computer will measure, in your cubicle, your performance. She said, in the end, the foreman will be replaced by the quiet violence of the computer. And I often think about, as I read about here in early 2021, all those students who are out there today on doing distance learning, or even just thinking of your journey as a student. Most of you began school in the early 2000s, when most school systems, or at least most school systems, hadn't even gone to computerized grading systems. Like, I literally remember back in the late 90s, in early 2000s, bubbling in Scantrons for report cards. And I'd have my black grade book, and I would have to average out every grade category and average a student. And I had no idea what an individual grade was on any given day. I only knew on progress report day and on end of quarter day, what their actual average was. I had feelings based on, test performance and whether they did homeworks or not, but it was just a feeling, right? So, but think about where we are today, right? Every time I check a homework, I put that homework into the computer. Your parents get a push notification on their Infinite Campus app, and your parents at any time can look at your grades. You can look at your grades. I can see your grades. Your guidance counselors can look at your grades. Your APs can look at your grades. Your principal can look at. Everyone can look at your grades, right? Everyone can measure your productivity as a student, on every single task that you've done and on every single grade, every single assessment that you have. Just think about that transition that has happened literally in your lifetime. And if you think that's going to get any different or any less intrusive, then as you go into your career, you're obviously mistaken. Right. So Taylorism is the word that we use to describe this phenomenon, right? This kind of more scientific views of productivity. Is it good? Sure. Is it bad? Sure. Okay. All right. So this basically runs down through these kind of basic, these basics of what we would call the price system or free market economics or capitalism, right? So this is all movements away from mercantilism, this kind of government-controlled economic monopolies that existed, right? So, right, focus on productivity, division of labor, specialization, all happening though through voluntary exchange. I don't have to buy things from a certain seller. They don't have to make those things. We're all just acting in our own self-interest, right? Laissez-faire economics, right? So as long as the government stays out, then the markets can work most efficiently, right? And of course, these free trade policies, we say this because capitalism is a departure from mercantilism, where like colonies had to trade only with the parent countries, and these highly restrictive trade policies with massive tariffs. And it's going to take a long time to kind of move away from this tariff model. Some countries still do it today, right? But the Industrial Revolution is going to lead to imperialism, which you could definitely call as a second wave of colonialism or another wave of colonialism. Why is it? It's the same reasons why colonialism happened in the 1500s, right? Access to raw materials and a market to sell your goods, right? So the basics of imperialism really aren't that much different. It's just, what is pushing this is different, and the level of totality of control is definitely changing, right? But free trade, right? This policy of free trade, which we connect so much, this is going to result in imperialism in a couple of cases or a number of cases. So some examples of how free trade resulted in imperialism by the British, more than what happened in Egypt in 1882. So as a result of their massive debt, this is going to lead to instability within Egypt. Fearing that this instability may result in loss of access to the Suez Canal, England feels compelled to take over Egypt, right, in order to protect its free trade to the Indian Ocean, or access to free trade in the Indian Ocean, right? We're also going to see this take, with the Qing dynasty, with the Opium Wars, right? So China in the 1830s wanted to restrict the sale of opium, right, opium products, and we see the British are willing to go to war in order to protect their right to free trade, even if that free trade is selling opium. And this is a huge debate that takes place in England. There's even a parliamentary election focused on this here. And but this is a topic we'll talk about later, right? But just know that this is an example. There's a whole bunch of others, right, as well here. Like one of the one of the other ways of looking at it is by looking at this poem I Pencil, and I believe it's by Leonard Reed. I do have a full version linked on my webpage if you go up above to this here, but it's 13 minutes, so we're not going to watch that one in class. We do watch this one, right? So this is the Milton Friedman going over this poem, and it's pretty quick, so 2 minutes. I'm just going to play this, but you do have a link if you want to just watch it there and skip to 2 minutes and then ahead. So here we go. It takes 10 seconds or so for my volume to work here. So I'll play it and then I'll restart this.
His students in this university as Adam, the basic principles underlying the free market, as Adam Smith taught them to his students in this university, are really very simple. Look at this lead pencil. There's not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. Remarkable statement? Not at all. The wood from which it's made, for all I know, comes from a tree that was cut down in the state of Washington. To cut down that tree, it took a saw. To make the saw, it took steel. To make the steel, it took iron ore. This black center, we call it lead, but it's really graphite, compressed graphite. I'm not sure where it comes from, but I think it comes from some mines in South America. This red top up here, the eraser, bit of rubber, probably comes from Malaya, where the rubber tree isn't even native. It was imported from South America by some businessmen with the help of the British government. This brass ferrule, I haven't the slightest idea where it came from, or the yellow paint, or the paint that made the black lines, or the glue that holds it together. Literally thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil. People who don't speak the same language, who practice different religions, who might hate one another if they ever met. When you go down to the store and buy this pencil, you are in effect trading a few minutes of your time for a few seconds of the time of all those thousands of people. What brought them together and induced them to cooperate to make this pencil? There was no commissar sending out orders from some central office. It was the magic of the price system, the impersonal operation of prices that brought them together and got them to cooperate to make this pencil so that you could have it for a trifling sum. That is why the operation of the free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more, to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
Right, so there's a claim being made there by Milton Friedman, right, that the price system or free market economics or capitalism promotes peace through kind of global integration, cooperation, right, mutual benefits, that kind of stuff. Right, and that is a claim that we can definitely explore as we get to the end of this course, right? We're going to get into globalization. But it's an interesting claim, right? And it's one that is definitely not without, plenty of evidence, right? So I believe that video series comes from the 1970s, when he did like a 10-hour, documentary series on economics. And right, he is creating this, 25, 30 years past World War II. And we are currently now, we are 75 plus years past World War II, right? So we are, there have been conflicts in the world since 1945, interstate wars, civil wars, small countries fighting other small countries. But we haven't had a major conflict in the world for, the better part of a century. And why is that? There's all kinds of reasons that you can use to explain that. Be it the whole mutually assured destruction, the technology, it's part of the Cold War, But you definitely have to at least acknowledge that free market capitalism and this global cooperation that is a necessary part of it is part of that story, of this long period of peace, that are the long peace, I believe as it is sometimes referred to as, right? So just kind of a different way of looking at these free trade policies and maybe some of the implications or some of the effects as they become more and more kind of pronounced into the 20th century. All right, so what do I have here? How do transnational businesses fit in with what Adam Smith wrote about? Right? And what anti-mercantilism, Adam Smith was anti-mercantilism in that it was a government monopoly and could interfere with we can infer monopolies in general that he would be against. Are transnational businesses consistent with this ideal? Right? Are they anti-mercantilist or are they anti-monopolies? And of course, a little bit of delving into a little U.S. history in Standard Oil will kind of give you the answer. This is kind of an interesting little counterpoint to Smith is sometimes governments intervene, in order to make more competition, right? So in the case of Standard Oil, the U.S. government perceived Standard Oil Corporation as being a monopolistic threat to competition, right? So I wonder. I mean, I don't know the answer to this, right? But I wonder if Adam Smith would be okay with that kind of government intervention for the sake of competition. It's kind of an interesting question. All right, just kind of go through just a different couple of other examples of how countries, because it's not all England, right? Of how countries during this time period, intervened for the sake of free trade. Obviously, the United States, right, will intervene a number of times for the sake of free trade, right? So you take this concept of big stick diplomacy, speak softly, carry big stick. So this is Teddy Roosevelt, right? So speak softly, settle disputes diplomatically, right? So be diplomatic when you can, and then carry a big stick when you cannot, right? So there's plenty of examples of big stick diplomacy. And Smedley Butler is a kind of an interesting case study of a life, right? He was the stick that was used by the U.S. government, in a lot of cases. Right, so we will build these battleships in order to be this big stick, right? But Smedley Butler is an interesting person. If you know somebody who is a Marine or a former Marine, all Marines learned about Smedley Butler when they're in boot camp. Right, he's kind of one of these most famous people of the Corps. Throughout the first part of the 20th century. Right, so he has a 34-year career, and his list of places where he was actively engaged it's amazing. So he gets to start as a very young man in the Spanish-American War, right? So he'll fight at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, against the Spanish, right? And then in 1900 he goes to China, with the Marine Corps to put down the Boxer Rebellion. And of course, this is done to protect the interests of the Standard Oil Corporation, who had investments in China, and those investments were being threatened. And then, of course, throughout Latin America, in a series of different examples. So he goes to Honduras on behalf of the United Fruit Company, right? Grenada, excuse me. In the Caribbean, Panama, 1909. Mexico, right, for Standard Oil, just like he had in China. Haiti, right, in 1915. Nicaragua, right, and back to China again in the late 1920s. So he goes right, all over the world, which means he's being deployed by the Marines, right? He's not the decision maker here. He's the soldier, right? So he's being deployed to protect free trade, right, in American business interests, all over the world, right? And of course, he, his career wraps up as part of a plot that happens in 1933, right? So there's kind of an interesting little excerpt Right, so this comes out of a documentary that was made a few years back, looking at corporations.
For big business, despotism was often a useful tool for securing foreign markets and pursuing profits. One of the U.S. Marine Corps' most highly decorated generals, Smedley Darlington Butler, by his own account, helped pacify Mexico for American oil companies, Haiti and Cuba for National City Bank, Nicaragua for the Brown Brothers brokerage, the Dominican Republic for sugar interests, Honduras for U.S. fruit companies, and China for Standard Oil. General Butler's services were also in demand in the United States itself in the 1930s, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sought to relieve the misery of the Depression through public enterprise and tougher regulations on corporate exploitation and schemes.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country behind you, filled with hope and patriotism.
But the country was not entirely behind the populist president. Large parts of the corporate elite despised what Roosevelt's New Deal stood for. And so, in 1934, a group of conspirators sought to involve General Butler in a treasonous plan.
And as outlined, the need was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government.
But the corporate cabal had picked the wrong man. Butler was fed up with being what he called a gangster for capitalism.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
A congressional committee ultimately found evidence of a plot to overthrow Roosevelt. According to Butler, the conspiracy included representatives of some of America's top corporations, including J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Goodyear Tire.
All right, so also kind of along these lines is what happens with Hawaii. And Hawaii is a really kind of interesting case study. If you look at it, right? So shortly after its discovery, so this is Captain Cook, right? So the British captain will be the first European to make contact, right? The islands united into the kingdom, shortly after that. So American Christian missionaries will convert many people, and the king the king of Hawaii converts to Christianity in 1825. White businessmen drafted a new constitution in 87. Now, this isn't the first constitution. There's actually a number of constitutions that came before this, going back as far as the 1830s. And so there had been a tradition of democracy. My Hawaiian history is definitely a little rusty, but I believe you have the monarch, right? So it was a constitutional monarchy. You have the monarchy, but you also have a bicameral legislature. The upper house was with nobility, and the lower house was an electorate of landowners. And we see that first kind of proto-democracy starting in Hawaii in the 1830s. That constitution was revised, I believe, in the early 1850s. And so you get a series of different rewrites. And I think this might be the fourth constitution in 1887. And this constitution can get signed under force, sometimes referred to as the bayonet constitution. And only landowners could vote, right, in favor of the white elite. So what had happened during these drafts is, the population of Hawaii begins to shift, as contact with the outside world increases. And you start to see, especially in the 1830s, the Hawaiian government or the monarchy leases land, initially to, I believe it's a Massachusetts sugarcane plantation owner. And as the decades go on, those plantation owners begin to demand, to be able to buy the property, own the property. And with that, you're going to start to see non-Hawaiians start to enter into the electorate. And so by the time we get to the late 1880s, you've got a very large non-Hawaiian land-owning class. At what used to be, a Hawaiian electorate, right? So what you're seeing here is, this kind of population decline. I guess we'll talk about this. I'll come back up with that in a second. Let's kind of finish this. So you have this bayonet constitution that favors the white elite, right? Or the American elite specifically, right? So the new queen will come to power. So this is Queen Lokalani, and she ends up being the last queen. She wants a new constitution. In European and American businessmen will stage a coup. The Marines, right, who will be in, because Pearl Harbor is brought into this story as well. So Pearl Harbor becomes a naval base, around this time as well, kind of around 1890. Right, so the Marines will be there. So the Marines will help support this, and the Queen will eventually be deposed. And New Republic is going to be installed by Stanford Dole. Now, Stanford Dole is not the Dole of the Dole Fruit Company. I believe he's the brother, right, of the founder of Dole Fruit Company. So, so Dole's presence here, I'm sure, was aided by the fact that his brother was the governor. And Dole will kind of make that transition from their export economy being primarily sugarcane, to eventually, pineapple becomes extremely important after the turn of the 20th century, right? And we see here going on during the Spanish-American War in 1898, especially as American interests start to get pulled further and further, into Asia, right? With our acquisition of the Philippines in the War of 1898. The strategic importance of Hawaii, Pearl Harbor as a naval base, and of course the sugarcane plantations there. The importance of Hawaii is definitely apparent. So the decision to annex it in 1898 is made and welcomed by Stanford Dole. So when people look at what Stanford Dole does is when he takes power in the early 1890s, he basically is just simply transitioning it to for annexation. All right. So what are we seeing here with this kind of population chart here? The late 19th century saw an increased presence of Asian indentured servants on the Hawaiian plantations. Right. So what are we seeing in this graph? We're seeing the population at the point of contact. Right. So Cook will come into contact, European contact in the 1770s. And the population is upwards of 250, as high as 300,000. I've read before. And you're going to see a general decrease in that population, right? So let's kind of just stop right about here in the 1830s, right? So we're seeing a decrease in population, very similar to many other indigenous populations who come into contact with Europeans. Disease, right? Disease is a major part of this story, right? And what we're going to start to see here, right? And you look here at 1853, this asterisk, right? 97.5% of the population are born in Hawaii, right? So when we look at the 73% or 73,000, almost all of that 73,000 are indigenous Hawaiians. And we're about 20 years at this point into the first, American-owned plantations, right? So, but as those plantations expand, right, we're going to see a demographic shift. We still see a decline in the population, right? But the percentage of the population who are of Hawaiian descent are much smaller, right? So even though the population is shrinking, a growing percentage of that population are immigrants into Hawaii. Some of them are coming from the United States, but a lot of them are not. A lot of them are coming from Japan specifically. There's a very large Japanese migration into Hawaii, and also some Chinese as well, right? But Japan is one of the largest sending nations, as part of this demographic shift that we see. Okay. All right. Let's do a quick little wrap up here. So what is the economic impact of the Industrial Revolution? Right, we see our transnational businesses, needs for stock markets increase. We see an expansion of stock markets, desire for natural resources and markets. In the United States begins to industrialize, similar to Europe, Japan, late 1800s, China, Ottoman attempted, but you're going to see elites who are not supportive. Right, so our multinational companies, right? They come from this, right? So this is an artistic painting. This is Rembrandt or not, but this is a painting of the stock exchange, right, in Amsterdam, right? Our VOC headquarters, right? Or at least where the stocks were traded, right? So we're going to see an intensification of this as we enter into our transnational industries. All right, so key takeaways, right? Western European countries begin to abandon mercantilism and adopt free trade policies, partly in response to the growing acceptance of Adam Smith's theories of laissez-faire capitalism and free markets. Right, we're going to see these proliferation of large-scale transnational businesses, new practices of banking, financing, right? And the development of industrial capitalism led to an increase in standard of living for some, right? And continued improvement for manufacturing methods, increased affordability, availability, and variety of consumer goods. All right, those are the positives. All right, so that is all for today. Sapriati.